Rome was not supposed to survive this moment. Not by logic, not by precedent, not by numbers. Ahead of them stood an enemy force so large it seemed to swallow the horizon itself. 10 times their size, 10 times their manpower, 10 times the certainty of victory. This was the kind of imbalance that ended civilizations, not battles. For centuries, Rome had built its identity on discipline, order, and control. Its legions were feared not because they were always larger, but because they were precise. But precision means little when the scale becomes absurd. This time, Rome was not merely outmatched, it was surrounded by inevitability. Messages traveled fast across the ancient world, and they carried the same conclusion everywhere. Rome was finished. No army could withstand such numbers, no formation could hold, no strategy could rewrite arithmetic. To many observers, the only mystery left was how long Rome would last before collapsing.
Inside the Roman camp, the reality was impossible to ignore. Soldiers could see the enemy fires stretching endlessly into the night. They could hear the noise of a force that had no fear of resistance. Veterans who had survived countless campaigns fell silent. Even experience had no answer for odds like these. This was not just a military crisis, it was an existential one. If Rome lost here, it would not simply retreat and rebuild. Its authority would shatter. Its allies would defect. Its enemies would rise. The idea of Rome as an unbreakable power would vanish in a single afternoon. What followed would not be recovery, but collapse. History often portrays Rome as invincible, but invincibility is a luxury of hindsight. In this moment, Rome was exposed, outnumbered, isolated, watching the rules that had always protected it begin to fail. And yet, Rome did not flee, it did not surrender, it did not dissolve into panic. Instead, it prepared to fight a battle that logic insisted it could not win. Why? That is the question that matters, because the answer is not found in numbers or weapons, but in something far more dangerous to any overwhelming force: control. To understand how Rome survived 10-to-1 odds, we must first understand the enemy that believed victory was guaranteed, and why sheer quantity alone would not be enough to erase Roman civilization on that field. They did not come as a disciplined army bound by caution or restraint. They came as mass, as momentum, as a force that believed victory was owed to it simply by scale. 10 soldiers for every Roman, 10 blades for every shield, 10 lives ready to be spent to erase one. The enemy's strength was not subtle, it was overwhelming by design. Their camps stretched farther than the eye could follow. Fires burned in endless lines through the night, a deliberate display meant to crush morale before the first clash. Noise was constant, shouting, movement, preparation, never allowing silence, never allowing rest. Psychological pressure was part of the strategy. To face such numbers was to face inevitability. Arithmetic alone argued against resistance. Even a perfect Roman soldier could only fight so long. Even the strongest formation would eventually crack beneath sheer weight. The enemy understood this and relied on it. They expected fear to do most of the work for them. Their aggression matched their scale. There was no patience, no interest in negotiation. Speed and force were preferred over planning. They believed pressure solved everything. When resistance appeared, they overwhelmed it. When defenses slowed them, they crushed them. Losses were irrelevant so long as momentum continued forward. This approach had worked everywhere else. Smaller armies broke under the strain. Cities surrendered before sieges even began. Reputation alone emptied roads and weakened resolve.
The enemy did not need perfect coordination, because quantity forgave mistakes. If one unit failed, 5 more filled the gap. From their perspective, Rome was simply the next obstacle. A symbol, yes, but one that could be buried under numbers like everything else. Civilization, to them, was fragile. Order was slow. Discipline was unnecessary when force could decide outcomes faster. The psychological imbalance was severe. Roman soldiers were trained to fight men, not tides. They had faced danger before, but never this sense of being consumed. Every glance toward the enemy reinforced the same message. You cannot kill enough of them. You cannot hold long enough. You cannot win. This was the contrast at the heart of the coming battle. On one side stood quantity without restraint. On the other stood civilization built on structure, rules, and control. One believed power came from mass. The other believed power came from cohesion. To the outside world, the choice seemed obvious.
Quantity always wins. Numbers always decide. History had taught that lesson repeatedly. When armies reached this scale, resistance became symbolic, not strategic. And that was the enemy's greatest confidence. They believed civilization could be drowned, that order could be crushed by weight alone, that discipline would fold under pressure just like everything else had before. They did not see Rome as an opponent with options. They saw it as an equation already solved. And it was precisely that belief, absolute, unexamined, and shared across their ranks, that would soon be tested in ways they had never prepared for. Rome had survived storms before, but rarely had it faced one while already fraying from within. The legions standing here were not fresh symbols of imperial strength. They were stretched thin by years of campaigning, pulled from distant fronts, and forced together under pressure rather than preparation. Manpower was a constant concern.
Some units were under strength, filled with recruits who had never faced full-scale battle. Veterans carried experience, but also fatigue. Armor was worn. Supplies were rationed carefully. There was no sense of abundance, only endurance. Every soldier understood that replacement was unlikely if losses mounted. Political pressure weighed heavily on command. Rome's leadership was divided, watching closely, calculating blame before victory was even certain. A defeat here would not be explained away. It would be remembered, weaponized by rivals, and used to question Rome's authority everywhere. Commanders fought not only an enemy, but expectation. Morale reflected that strain. Soldiers trusted their training, but they were not blind to reality. They could count. They could see the horizon filled with enemies. Confidence did not vanish, but it narrowed, becoming personal rather than collective. Each man focused on survival, not triumph. Logistics added another layer of vulnerability.
Rome's strength depended on supply lines, and those lines were fragile here. Delays meant hunger. Disruption meant collapse. The enemy knew this. Time was not neutral. Every passing hour favored numbers over discipline. Even the terrain offered no comfort. Positions were chosen out of necessity, not advantage. Defensive options were limited. Retreat routes uncertain. Rome was fighting where it had to, not where it wanted to. This was not the Rome of expansion and momentum. This was Rome reacting, adapting, and absorbing pressure. Its usual advantages felt thinner, more brittle. Tradition alone could not guarantee survival. And that was the danger. Rome's reputation suggested control, but the reality was vulnerability. The legions were disciplined, but exhausted. The command structure was intact, but strained. Everything that normally made Rome formidable was present, yet diminished. In another moment, under different conditions, Rome might have dictated terms. Here, it could only respond. Timing had turned against it completely. If there was ever a moment when Rome could have been erased, this was it. And as the enemy closed in, the question was no longer whether Rome was strong, but whether strength alone would be enough. Every advantage felt temporary. Every mistake felt final. The legions stood aware that history rarely offered second chances. Whatever happened next would define Rome far beyond this battlefield, echoing through politics, borders, and belief itself, long after the dust settled and the survivors were counted. And for the first time, Rome had to confront the possibility of disappearance entirely, completely, and without mercy. Defeat did not feel dramatic. It felt logical. On paper, the outcome appeared settled before the first command was given. Rome faced an enemy nearly 10 times its size, a disparity no formation or reputation could truly erase. Military logic favored mass. History favored numbers.
Arithmetic alone argued that resistance was pointless. Terrain offered no salvation. Rome was not positioned on ground of its choosing.
There were no perfect choke points, no natural barriers capable of neutralizing such overwhelming force. Any line Rome formed could be stretched, flanked, and eventually broken simply through pressure. Space favored the many, not the few. Supply worsened the equation. Roman strength depended on steady logistics, but those lines were thin and vulnerable. Feeding and equipping legions under constant threat was difficult enough. Prolonged engagement would favor the larger force, which could absorb losses and outlast discipline through sheer endurance. Time itself worked against Rome. Morale followed numbers. Roman soldiers were trained professionals, but even discipline has limits. Facing endless ranks tests confidence in ways drills cannot prepare for. The enemy, by contrast, drew morale from scale.
Each soldier advanced knowing he was one of many, not one of few. That psychological imbalance mattered. History offered grim reminders. Rome had suffered before when outnumbered and overextended. Entire legions had vanished in past disasters, undone not by incompetence, but by circumstance. Those memories lingered in command discussions and soldier whispers alike. Rome knew it was not immune to collapse. Strategically, Rome appeared trapped between bad options: stand firm and risk being enveloped, maneuver and risk fragmentation, retreat and risk total disintegration. Every path carried catastrophic potential. There was no obvious solution, only varying degrees of disaster. Even Rome's greatest strength, discipline, seemed fragile here. Discipline works best when pressure is manageable, when cohesion can be maintained. Against overwhelming mass, cohesion becomes harder to preserve. Once a single section broke, the rest could unravel rapidly.
From the outside, observers reached the same conclusion. Rome was brave, but bravery would not change outcomes. Civilization had faced moments like this before and lost. Empires had fallen when logic said they should. This is why belief settled in so completely. Rome could fight honorably, but not successfully. Victory was framed as impossible, survival as unlikely, defeat as inevitable. And yet it was precisely this certainty that concealed a flaw. Because when defeat feels guaranteed, enemies stop questioning assumptions. And that is where Rome would soon strike. Not against numbers, but against the logic that believed numbers alone decided history. Rome's advantage was not hidden in weapons or numbers, it was embedded in behavior. While the enemy relied on mass and momentum, Rome relied on control, and control functions differently under pressure. Every Roman soldier understood his place. Training had reduced chaos into habit. Movements were drilled until they required no thought.
When fear surged, routine remained. That alone was powerful. 10 enemies could intimidate a man, but 10,000 could still be faced if order held. Command structure amplified that discipline. Orders did not drift through confusion. They traveled clearly, passed down predictable lines, reinforced by authority and expectation. Roman officers were trained to command units independently if needed, ensuring cohesion even when communication failed. The army was designed to fracture without collapsing. Adaptability was the final piece. Roman tactics were not rigid traditions carved into stone. They were systems meant to evolve. Commanders observed, adjusted, and exploited patterns quickly. Where others repeated what had always worked, Rome changed what no longer did. This mattered more than numbers. An undisciplined mass could overwhelm through shock, but it struggled when momentum slowed. Rome specialized in slowing fights. Shield walls absorbed impact. Rotations replaced exhausted men.
Pressure was met, not resisted blindly. The contrast became visible early. The enemy advanced with confidence, but little coordination. Units surged unevenly, driven by aggression rather than alignment. Rome responded in controlled movements, maintaining spacing, angles, and mutual support. Fewer men, acting together, generated stability. Roman soldiers trusted the system. That trust reduced panic. Each man knew someone covered his flank. Someone replaced him when fatigue set in. Someone would respond if he fell. Confidence did not come from superiority, but from reliability. This was not heroic spectacle. It was methodical, quiet, unimpressive to onlookers expecting drama. But under pressure, method outlasts force. Control absorbs chaos rather than competing with it.
History often mistakes flexibility for weakness. Rome understood the opposite. Flexibility preserved strength. Discipline allowed adaptation without collapse. Together, they transformed inferiority into leverage. The enemy had numbers. Rome had cohesion. The enemy had aggression. Rome had timing. The enemy trusted mass. Rome trusted structure. This was the advantage no one expected to matter. It did not guarantee victory. It did not eliminate risk. But it created something essential: options. Rome could choose how to respond rather than react blindly. And in battles decided by seconds and positioning, that choice mattered more than any numerical advantage ever could. The coming clash would prove whether control could survive against overwhelming force. Because once pressure reached its peak, discipline would be tested, and only one side was built to endure that test. It was an advantage forged over generations, paid for with drills, punishment, and repetition. Rome had invested in preparation when others invested in size. That investment now stood between survival and collapse. Discipline was not inspiring in stories, but it was decisive in reality. As the enemy prepared to overwhelm through weight alone, Rome prepared to control the moment. And in wars where control decides outcomes, that preparation would soon face its ultimate trial. It would determine whether order could outlast chaos, and whether Rome could still dictate fate when everything argued against it. The answer waited in the next movements, where theory would meet blood and discipline would meet fear head-on there. Rome understood that it could not defeat numbers by meeting them head-on. That lesson was clear. The strategy, therefore, did not aim to destroy the enemy's strength. It aimed to misalign it. The first decision was positioning. Rome refused to spread thin in response to the enemy's scale. Instead, the legions compressed their frontage, tightening formations to deny space. This forced the enemy's advantage into a narrower corridor where 10 soldiers could not fight at once. Numbers still existed, but they could no longer act together.
Next came formation discipline. Roman lines were arranged in depth rather than width. Front ranks absorbed pressure, then rotated backward while fresh soldiers stepped forward. Fatigue was managed deliberately. Where the enemy surged until exhaustion, Rome paced itself. This transformed endurance into a weapon. Timing mattered even more than placement. Rome did not rush to engage fully. It allowed the enemy to commit first, pushing forward with confidence, expending energy early. Only once momentum peaked did Roman units tighten, locking shields, shortening lines, and slowing the advance. Speed turned into congestion, aggression turned into friction. This was intentional. Large forces rely on movement. Once movement stalls, coordination fractures. Rome exploited that truth relentlessly. Short, controlled counterpressures disrupted rhythm without overcommitting. The enemy kept pushing, but progress slowed. Confusion crept in. Commanders then applied selective pressure, not everywhere.
Only where cohesion weakened. A step forward here, a hold there, a controlled withdrawal elsewhere. To the enemy, it appeared inconsistent. To Rome, it was calculated. The goal was not collapse, but imbalance. Communication played a crucial role. Roman officers relayed orders efficiently, allowing adjustments in real time. When enemy units surged unevenly, Rome responded locally rather than globally. This prevented domino failures. Small corrections preserved overall stability. As minutes passed, numbers became a liability. Enemy troops packed tighter, limiting movement and visibility. Rear ranks pushed forward blindly, unaware of conditions ahead. Pressure increased without progress. Exhaustion mounted. Morale wavered as expected results failed to appear. Rome then exploited the moment. Short, aggressive engagements targeted overextended units. Not prolonged clashes, but sudden violence followed by restraint. The enemy lost tempo. Momentum shattered into disconnected efforts.
Critically, Rome never pursued recklessly. Victory depended on restraint as much as aggression. Every advance was measured, every success consolidated. The legions refused to chase panic, understanding that chaos favored the larger force if allowed to reset. This strategy demanded absolute discipline. A single premature advance could expose flanks. A delayed rotation could collapse a section. There was no margin for error. Every movement depended on trust, training, and timing aligning perfectly. And that was the risk. If the enemy broke through before congestion set in, Rome would be overwhelmed instantly. If fatigue overtook discipline, formations would dissolve. If communication failed, control would vanish. This was not a plan designed for safety. It was designed for necessity. Rome gambled that control could outlast force, that cohesion could fracture mass, and that patience could defeat speed.
As the battle tightened and pressure intensified, the strategy moved from theory to survival. Every Roman soldier now carried the weight of execution. There would be no second attempt, no recovery if this failed. If Rome misjudged even slightly, the legions would not retreat, they would be erased. And as the enemy pressed forward, unaware that its greatest strength was now being turned inward, the battlefield narrowed into a single question. Could discipline survive long enough to turn inevitability into collapse? The battle did not announce itself with speeches or signals. It began with motion. Dust rose as the enemy advanced, thousands moving forward in waves that seemed to stretch endlessly across the land. The sound followed: footsteps, shouted commands, the clatter of weapons striking shields in anticipation. The ground itself appeared to tremble under the weight of so many bodies moving with purpose. Roman soldiers felt it immediately. The pressure was physical, not abstract.
Heat built inside armor, hands tightened around shields slick with sweat. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It crept in as the distance closed, as faces became visible, as the sheer scale of the enemy erased any illusion of balance. This was what 10-to-1 looked like when it moved. The first impact was violent. Enemy ranks slammed into Roman lines with raw force, pushing, striking, shouting. Shields crashed together, spears bent and snapped. The noise became overwhelming. Metal on metal, wood splintering, men screaming in pain or rage. For a moment it felt as if discipline itself might be crushed under sheer momentum. But the Roman line held. Not because it was stronger, but because it was prepared. Shields locked, feet planted. Front ranks absorbed the shock, giving ground only inches at a time. Behind them, soldiers waited, counting breaths, ready to rotate forward. The enemy surged again, expecting collapse. It did not come. Chaos spread unevenly.
Where the enemy pressed hardest, progress slowed. Bodies packed tighter. Movement became difficult. Orders were shouted, then lost in noise. Rear ranks continued pushing forward, unaware that the front had stalled. Pressure increased, but coordination did not. Rome responded with restraint. Short thrusts, controlled movements. No pursuit, no panic. The legions fought in segments. Each unit focused on its immediate task, rather than the whole battlefield. That focus mattered. It prevented fear from spreading faster than control. Sound became disorienting. Commands blurred into screams. Dust thickened the air, reducing vision to shapes and shadows. Time fractured into moments of impact and recovery. Soldiers fought on instinct, guided by training drilled into muscle and reflex. Enemy aggression intensified. They struck harder, angrier, confused by resistance that refused to break. Losses mounted, but momentum demanded continuation. Stopping felt impossible.
To retreat under such pressure risked collapse, so they pushed forward again. That decision deepened the trap. As the enemy compressed further, Rome adjusted. Rotations increased. Fresh soldiers replaced exhausted ones seamlessly. Pressure was met with structure, not emotion. The battlefield narrowed into controlled violence, where numbers could no longer act freely. Fear transformed. For Romans, it sharpened into focus. For the enemy, it curdled into frustration. Expected victory was delayed. Delayed victory bred doubt. Doubt disrupted rhythm. Some sections buckled briefly, then stabilized. Others held firm beyond expectation. Roman officers moved constantly, reinforcing weak points, adjusting spacing, correcting angles. Control was not perfect, but it was continuous. The enemy's mass, once an advantage, became a burden. Movement slowed, visibility dropped, coordination failed. Individual courage remained, but collective direction faded.
Thousands fought, but fewer understood where or why. The clash intensified without resolution. Blood soaked the ground.
Bodies piled where movement stalled. The air grew heavy with exhaustion and smoke. Yet still the Roman line endured. This was not the decisive moment yet, but something had changed. The battle was no longer unfolding according to expectation. Numbers were no longer deciding pace. Discipline was. As pressure mounted and fatigue deepened, both sides sensed it. This fight would not be decided by who struck harder, but by who lasted longer under control. And somewhere within the chaos, as formations tightened and momentum slowed, the conditions Rome needed were beginning to form. The question was no longer whether Rome would break immediately. It was whether the enemy could sustain force once its greatest advantage had been neutralized. The answer was about to emerge from the noise, the dust, and the strain of men pushed beyond what numbers alone could carry.
The turning point did not arrive with a single shout or a dramatic collapse. It arrived quietly, hidden inside hesitation. For the first time, the enemy's advance slowed not because of resistance, but because of uncertainty. Units pressed forward, then stalled. Commands overlapped. Momentum, once effortless, began to fracture. Rome felt it before it saw it. Pressure on the shields eased slightly. The rhythm of impact changed. What had been a constant surge became uneven pulses. Roman officers recognized the shift immediately. This was the moment discipline had been waiting for. Orders tightened. Rotations became sharper. Roman lines shortened by design, drawing the enemy even closer together. Where the enemy expected space to regroup, it found congestion. Where it expected retreat, it met stability. Every Roman movement now served a single purpose: deny recovery. The enemy's numbers worked against them. Rear ranks continued pushing forward, unaware that the front had lost momentum.
Soldiers collided with one another. Visibility dropped further as dust and bodies compressed the field. Shouted orders reached fewer ears. Coordination, once assumed, began to dissolve. Confusion spread unevenly, which made it worse. Some units fought harder, forcing themselves forward through instinct and anger. Others hesitated, sensing something was wrong, but unable to identify it. The battlefield fractured into disconnected struggles, each draining energy without advancing the larger goal. Rome exploited this fracture with precision. Not everywhere, only where control could be maintained. Short advances targeted overextended enemy groups. Shield walls pressed forward briefly, then stopped. The goal was not breakthrough, but disruption. Every action widened imbalance. For the enemy, panic crept in silently. Victory was expected by now. Resistance should have collapsed. Instead, progress felt heavier with every step. Losses mounted without reward. Fatigue deepened. Confidence cracked.
Roman discipline now became visible even amid chaos. Exhausted soldiers rotated out smoothly, commands adjusted formations in real time. When pressure increased in one sector, support shifted without destabilizing others. Control remained intact. The contrast reached its peak. 10 soldiers still stood against 1 Roman. The numbers had not changed, but power had shifted. Rome dictated pace. Rome chose when to advance, when to hold, when to absorb. The enemy reacted. Some enemy units attempted to pull back to regroup. That movement created gaps. Others surged forward to compensate, creating further imbalance. The mass no longer moved as one. It collided with itself. Roman officers seized these moments. Small advances locked enemy units in place. Targeted pressure broke cohesion locally without overextension. Rome never chased panic. It consolidated control. The psychological shift was devastating. Soldiers who had never known resistance now faced it everywhere.
Commands no longer guaranteed results. Effort no longer produced progress. Fear, once Rome's burden, transferred sides. This was the moment history rarely records clearly. No banner fell. No single blow ended the fight. But belief changed. Rome now believed it could win. The enemy realized it might not. From that point on, every Roman action reinforced confidence. Every enemy misstep deepened doubt. Momentum no longer belonged to numbers. It belonged to control. The battlefield reflected it. Enemy formations dissolved into clusters. Roman lines remained intact. Chaos favored discipline now, not mass. Exhaustion punished aggression, not patience. Rome did not celebrate. There was still fighting, still danger, still blood. But the battle's direction was set. The enemy could still cause damage, but it could no longer decide the outcome. Control had replaced force. And once control shifts, numbers stop being decisive. From this moment forward, Rome was no longer surviving the battle.
It was shaping it. The enemy had lost the initiative, and without initiative, even 10 times the numbers could not restore what had slipped away. The war was not over yet, but the moment that mattered most had already passed, quietly, amid dust and hesitation. History had turned without ceremony, placing its weight behind discipline rather than mass. The shock did not come from the battlefield alone. It came from what followed. News of Rome's victory traveled faster than explanations could keep up. Messengers carried the outcome across cities and courts, and everywhere it arrived, disbelief followed. Rome had been outnumbered 10-1. By every known rule of war, it should have been destroyed. Instead, it had prevailed. Politically, the impact was immediate. Allies who had hesitated now realigned. Neutral states recalculated their positions. Enemies who had expected Rome's collapse suddenly faced a power that had proven it could survive the impossible.
Rome's authority, shaken before the battle, was restored with force, not through conquest, but through credibility. Reputation mattered deeply in the ancient world, and Rome's reputation transformed overnight. This was no longer just a disciplined empire. It was an empire that could not be erased by numbers alone. That perception carried weight far beyond the battlefield. Power depends on belief, and belief had shifted decisively back in Rome's favor. For Rome's enemies, the defeat was devastating psychologically. They had relied on scale as certainty. When that certainty failed, confidence collapsed with it. Units that survived the battle carried stories of stalled advances, endless resistance, and exhaustion without reward. Fear replaced arrogance. Doubt spread where momentum once ruled. This is where myth and truth diverge. Later retellings simplified the victory, attributing it to luck, fate, or enemy mistakes. But luck does not hold formations together under pressure.
Luck does not manage rotations, timing, and restraint for hours of sustained combat. What shocked the ancient world was not that Rome won, but how it won. Observers studied the battle carefully. They noted discipline, control, and adaptability. They saw that Rome had not defeated numbers by matching them, but by neutralizing them. That lesson mattered. It challenged assumptions that had governed warfare for generations. The victory reshaped expectations. Resistance was no longer automatically futile. Smaller forces could survive against overwhelming odds if they controlled conditions. That realization echoed across future conflicts, influencing how wars were planned and fought. Rome did not emerge unscathed. Losses were real. The victory was costly, but it was decisive in ways that extended beyond territory. It preserved Rome's standing, stabilized its influence, and reinforced the idea that structure could defeat mass. The ancient world understood something fundamental had changed.
Not the balance of power, but the understanding of it. Numbers still mattered, force still mattered, but they were no longer absolute. Rome had proven that history is not decided solely by size, but by how power is applied. And once that truth was demonstrated, it could not be forgotten. Rome did not leave this battlefield with songs of conquest or monuments raised in triumph. What it carried forward was something far more powerful, a lesson that refused to age. For centuries, history had favored the assumption that numbers decide outcomes. Bigger armies, larger coalitions, overwhelming force. This battle did not erase that reality, but it shattered its authority. Rome proved that numbers are a factor, not a verdict. What endured was discipline under pressure, decisions made when fear was loudest, leadership that valued control over impulse.
Rome survived not because it was the strongest, but because it understood how strength actually functions when everything begins to break.
This moment reshaped how Rome fought wars afterward. Commanders refined systems that prioritized cohesion, flexibility, and initiative at every level. Armies across the ancient world studied Roman methods not to match its size, but to replicate its structure. The idea that smaller forces could dictate conditions became a permanent shift in military thinking. The impact extended beyond battlefields. Politically, Rome reinforced its credibility. Allies trusted it not because it was invincible, but because it was resilient. Enemies learned that inevitability could be challenged. Authority, Rome demonstrated, is sustained by systems that endure stress, not by fear alone. There is an uncomfortable truth hidden inside this legacy. Survival is rarely glorious in the moment. It is controlled, exhausting, and deeply human. Rome did not win through spectacle. It won through restraint and execution.
History often celebrates expansion, but civilizations are defined by the moments they refuse to disappear. This was one of those moments. When logic argued for surrender, Rome chose discipline. When numbers argued for collapse, Rome chose control. Numbers still matter, power still matters, but they do not decide history on their own. Rome's victory proved that history bends towards those who can hold themselves together when everything else comes apart.